Right, so we are ready now. It's going to be 5 p.m., so we shall start without. Okay, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to everyone. I'm Professor Maheshwar Satpathy on the virtual stage of Global Consortium of Global Health. I welcome everyone who will be joining today's advanced training series on health research methods in health and ethics. And today's session is session number 12. Okay, and today we have been joined with by Professor Mohanji Datta from Massey University, New Zealand. So it's my utmost pleasure to welcome him. It's an honor, in fact, and we look forward to doing the formal process. But I would request now Faisal, the Global Chief Operating Officer of Global Consortium of Global Health Learning and Delivery Programs, to initiate the process. Thank you. Faisal.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to everyone joining us from across the globe. A heartfelt welcome to all of you to today's advanced training session of the advanced training series on methods in health research and ethics, organized by the Global Consortium of Global Health Actors, Leaders, and Thinkers in collaboration with the Global Health Forum, World AIDS Forum, Global Brain and Mental Health Forum, and local delivery partner Bangladesh Institute of Innovative Health Research. We are now in the final week of this globally inclusive and intellectually transformative certification journey that has brought together global health leaders, early career researchers, and innovators under a shared vision of equity and transformation. Today marks the final advanced training session of our international workshop and panel discussion series, which features eminent speakers from around the globe each weekend. So far, we have had a group of preeminent and world-renowned speakers from top academic institutions and top global organizations in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, Australia, India, Malaysia, Singapore, and the UK, USA. Today's session marks a significant milestone in our journey, one where health communication meets cultural grounding, critical reflexivity, and community voices. The session is titled Culture-Centered Approach to Health Communication. We gather uh, once again, we are joined by our respected moderator and host, Professor Maheshwar Satpathy, CEO and founder of Global Alt and director at COE SSC PHP, who will guide us through this session throughout. The lead organizer of this program, the Global Consortium of Global Health Actors, Leaders, and Thinkers, Global Alt, operates under the Global Health Leadership by Global South Initiative, a flagship program of the Global Health Forum since January 2025. The Global Consortium brings together global health experts, researchers, practitioners, and policymakers, especially from developing and underrepresented regions, to collaborate on transformative research that drives equity and systemic change in health. As of today, the Global Consortium is the largest dedicated consortium, professional consortium of global health with more than 2,700 leaders from 170 plus countries who have applied to be members through a rigorous process of member selection and with full documentation of members' credentials. In addition, 260 plus small and large organizations of value and civil society organizations have applied to be our member collaborating centers of excellence in the Global South. Our vision is reimagining global health leadership by the Global South, decolonizing global health. We are the global alternative. The Global Health Forum, elevating voices, reimagining global health, building equitable futures for all since 2018. The Global Health Forum is a dynamic international platform committed to transforming global health through inclusive dialogue, critical research, and ethical collaboration. As the parent institution contributing to the Global Consortium of Global Health Alt, GHF serves as a bridge between academia, policy, practice, and communities, especially those from low and middle income countries and underrepresented regions. GHF envisions a future where global health is decolonized, democratic, and driven by the lived experiences of those at the margins. We create space for cross-disciplinary exchange, and nurture the next generation of global health leaders through strategic training programs, public health forums, and capacity building initiatives that cut across the geographic borders, cultural and social milieu, and disciplinary boundaries. World AIDS Forum since 2011, a high-level global forum to network and collaborate with all stakeholders and communities on infectious disease, HIV and AIDS, BVVs and STIs, with the aim to unite the world to inform, debate, discuss, and act. Instrumental in conducting several hundred programs, interventions, several program delivery and implementation, and knowledge dissemination and intensive community outreach by leading and collaborating with program partners from all over the world. The Global Brain and Mental Health Forum, Reimagining Mental Health Leadership for a Resilient and Equitable World. Since 2020, GBMHF is a collaborative interdisciplinary platform dedicated to advancing brain health and mental well-being through research, policy advocacy, and international knowledge exchange. Founded as part of the broader vision of the Global Health Forum and to complement with the mission and objectives of the Global Alt, GBMHF aims to unite researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and people with mental health issues, as well as the lived experience advocates across the globe, particularly from the Global South. We focus on building capacity and neuropsychiatric research, destigmatizing mental illness, and promoting culturally competent mental health systems that are equitable, accessible, and sustainable for all. Through academic programs, high-level dialogues, and grassroots initiatives, the Forum champions a holistic, intersectional, and inclusive approach to mental health. Bangladesh Institute of Innovative Health Research is a non-profit research organization led by the volunteers. It works to encourage research among young novice researchers since 2023. BHR has been active in research and has regularly organized training sessions, workshops, and seminars to help build research skills. The team includes around 40 student research assistants and more than 10 members in core managerial roles. BHR is committed to supporting the next generation of researchers and helping improve public health in Bangladesh. Some ground rules for our session participants. Please be muted during the session. Unless you are invited to speak, use the chat box and Q&A for any kind of reflections or questions that arise during the session. Your attendance will be tracked from start to end, and an additional attendance form will be shared during the session. So please be attentive to the session so that you don't miss the attendance form. Maintain a respectful and inclusive environment throughout. Chat box will be monitored regularly. Any unnecessary, repetitive, disrespectful, unprofessional, and hateful comment in the chat box or Q&A targeted towards anyone will be deleted, and such persons will be removed from the session. So as the world battles misinformation, cultural or alienation, and health disparities, it is now more important than ever to revisit the way we communicate health, not just to, but with communities. Today's training will explore how we can center marginalized voices, cultural frameworks, and participatory praxis to co-create transformative health systems and inclusive policy communication strategies. We are honored and truly privileged to have with us today Professor Mohanji Datta, Dean's Chair and Professor Communication and Director, Center for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation, CARE, Massey University, New Zealand. Hosted and moderated by Professor Maheshwar Satpathy, who is a world-renowned leader in One Health, Global Health, Planetary Health, and Brain and Mental Health. He is a much sought-after expert in epidemiology, health emergencies, and implementation science, and health innovation using the power of emerging and futuristic technologies such as AI, ML, LLM, and generative AI, and geospatial information system science and technologies, and remote sensing. He builds on his core areas of expertise in cognitive and computational neuroscience, psychology, and global health to benefit humanity. His sustained engagement with UN Sustainable Development Goals and ethics in the broader area of public policy has led to holistic societal transformations in various LMICs. Professor Satpathy has a humble H index of 81 and cumulative citations over 160,000 plus. He has published extensively 25 plus peer-reviewed scientific articles and book chapters in journals of global repute, notably in Nature, Science, The Lancet, NEJM, JAMA, BMJ, PLOS, etc. and has offered keynotes and invited talks at more than 200 top international conferences and global congresses in the past 20 years. He has an impressive all-metric score of 68,255, exemplifying the large-scale social impact driven by their work. Professor Satpathy is currently a research fellow, research professor at the Institute for Global Health and UCL Global Business School for Health of University College London, UK, and is also substantive faculty member, professor at Utkal University, Bhubaneswar, India. He is the director and lead of the Center of Excellence in Environment, Climate Change, and Public Health and Policy at a joint initiative of the Government of India and Odisha since 2023. His strong diplomatic skills and a proven track record in developing strategic research partnerships have helped form vital global collaborations enriching public health and mental health policies and initiatives. His multidisciplinary approach, integrating development policy with global health, has empowered teams to translate complex research into societal impact in LMICs. So we now invite Professor Maheshwar Satpathy to introduce our Professor Mohan J. Datta a bit more and initiate the session, please.
Thank you, dear Faisal, for the generous introduction. So kind of you. So it's my utmost honor and privilege to welcome Professor Mohan J. Datta to the virtual stage of Conceptual, and also my pleasure to read his extremely humbling bio. I have got thought quite a lot because it was huge, and I was just going on, and I'm like, this is really something that people need to hear, but we won't have all the time. So I'm going to read out a few things which I'm sure will just amaze all of you, those who are listening to me now, about his profile. Okay, Professor Mohan J. Datta, Dean's Chair in Communication, School of Humanities, Media and Creative Communication, and based on his work on healthcare among indigenous communities, I'm starting in a very different format today. Based on his work on healthcare among indigenous communities, sex workers, migrant workers, farmers, and communities living in extreme poverty, Professor Datta has developed an approach called the culture-centered approach, which he will be talking about shortly, that outlines culturally based participatory strategies of radical democracy for addressing unequal health policies. Based on academic activist collaborations, the culture-centered approach uses fieldwork, registive strategies for performance, and dialogue-based reflexive participation to create entry points for listening to the voices of communities at the global margins. At the core of his research agenda is the activist emphasis on provincializing Eurocentric knowledge structures and decentering hegemonic knowledge constructions through subaltern participation. And this is probably one of the reasons why I and my ideologies and our voices resonate so well, because basically I'm more of an activist and less of an academic. So he has received over $4 million in funding to work on Culture Center project of health communication, social change, and health advocacy. Recently, he also completed a $1.5 million grant funded by Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, AHRQ, to develop a culturally centered health communication project on heart disease among African American communities in the Lake and Marion counties of Indiana. This community-grounded project interrogating the unhealthy structures that became the basis for multiple organic projects rooted in the aspirations in the community for health and well-being. At NUS, he received over $2 million in funding to run culture center projects of health across Asia, including projects on food insecurity in West Bengal, India, poverty and health in Singapore, health among migrant workers in low-skilled sectors, health of transgender sex workers, health among Malays, and cardiovascular health and marginalization at Massey, New Zealand. He looks forward to building the work of care in the areas of indigenous health, health and migration, and poverty. The social impact in Mohan Datta's work bridges activist interventions and academic knowledge production, delineating the tensions, divergences, and convergences when academics, activists, and communities come together in co-creating transformative practices. He is interested in theorizing the nature of productive practices of academic performance, situated at the intersections of subaltern politics, activist commitments, and academic research. Professor Datta explores these tensions in academic activist community collaborations through his own experiments with collaboration and solidarity. I think we are doing a small experiment of that sort, Professor Datta, here as well. this advanced certification program is one of the kind as well. Professor Datta has published the book Communicating Social Change, Structure, Culture, Agency in collaboration with Taylor and Francis, and more recently Voices of Resistance published by Purdue University Press. He was awarded the Lewis Donoghue Outstanding Health Communication Scholar Award in recognition of his work. Also at Purdue, he was awarded the prestigious University Scholar Award for his research excellence. Professor Datta has an impressive H-index of 68 and cumulative citations bordering 18,000. In addition to teaching, writing, and conducting fieldwork in collaboration with activist group, Professor Datta enjoys spending leisure time with his wife, and today is his anniversary, I think. Children Slok, Trisha, Soham, nieces and nephews, parents and siblings, and an extended family of performers and activists, literally every family in Bengali families, and stimulating conversations with his advisees, usually over meals, organizing opportunities and radical democracy with grassroots groups, and participating in creative production, script writing, and direction for 360-degree campaigns. In his most recent performance work, he has served as the visiting artistic director for Ritvik, a grassroots group in West Bengal, India, working on performance for social change. He has also directed the Singaporeans Left Behind, Voices of Hunger, and Respect Our Rights campaigns and documentary films. Professor Datta is the winner of 2016 International Communication Association ICA Applied Public Policy Communication Research Award and the 2018 Outstanding Health Communication Scholar Award. He serves on the advisory panel of the World Health Organization Cultural Context of Health CCS group. So with this very humbling bio, I welcome Professor Datta. Please, the stage is all yours. Please illuminate us with your 30 years of experience and vast wisdom. And the floor is on yours. Thank you.
Namaskar,
So
and thank you so much, Professor Satpathy, for that beautiful introduction and that humbling introduction. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you, and I look forward to this opportunity to dialogue with you and with the participants. I want to begin by acknowledging the indigenous people of Rangitane, who are the traditional people of this land in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and whose wisdom, knowledge, and land shape the spaces in which we are able to have these conversations. I also want to acknowledge the struggle of the Palestinian people against ongoing processes of settler colonial exploitation. And it's a reminder that any conversation on decolonization and decolonizing health ultimately has to explore questions of how we build anti-colonial registers against ongoing processes of settler colonial violence, imperial violence, and racial capitalist violence. So with that in mind, what I will do is I will share my PowerPoint screen, and we can go ahead and sort of have a conversation in the sense of a dialogue. I will have a few prompts, and hopefully we can break into groups when working through these prompts and sort of run it more like an interactive workshop, if you will. So what I have titled this presentation as is to explore culture-centered methods for health communication, and particularly looking at the nuts and bolts of the culture-centered approach. So it's my hope that as you work through this approach, when thinking of adopting this approach in your own work, you would consider the kinds of methodological tools that we will be working through in this conversation. So in sharing this work, I want to acknowledge the multiple communities across 12 plus countries where the Center I Direct Care does its work using the culture-centered approach. I particularly want to acknowledge the many activists and residents who spend time at CARE, developing concepts and theories of social change, really mapping out how communities organize around questions of health and social justice, and what does health activism look like. I also want to acknowledge the community researchers that actually hold up this work. Oftentimes, what happens when we talk about the academic nature of knowledge production is that we have a tendency to erase the notion that knowledge is produced in community. And the culture-centered approach offers us an invitation to actually engage with communities and recognize the power of communities as producers of knowledge. So I want to begin by acknowledging those many community researchers who are the knowledge producers in this work. So in today's outline, what I will do is I will begin by offering a critique of dominant methods of doing health communication work. Based on that critique, I will explore this concept of communicative inequality or inequality in opportunities for participation of deeply marginalized communities, arguing that it is the erasure of communities that often shapes the experiences of marginalization. On the basis of that, I will talk about a concept in the culture-centered approach called voice infrastructures and explore with you the methods for how we build these voice infrastructures. And then I will wrap up by talking about one of the most critical concepts in the culture-centered approach, which is suturing solidarities. How do we actually weave together solidarities in connecting communities in order to build global infrastructures of resistance against those structural determinants of health that result in poor health. Now, in this background, you see the image from Shautali village in the Jhargram district of West Bengal, where I have been carrying out my work over the past 2 decades. And this work centers on this question of what does it mean for Adivasi or indigenous people to own knowledge and to work through that knowledge to generate theories of health that are anchored in indigenous relationship with land, with ecosystem, with forests and cultural practices, based on the argument that the concepts of land, culture are integral to how we come to theorize health. So then for health communication, it becomes an important question in terms of what does it mean to produce generative conditions that support health when indigenous communities across the globe are continually threatened to be expelled and displaced from the lands they live in. So what does it mean to do health communication work amidst the ongoing erasure of indigenous peoples? So to that question then, the culture-centered approach suggests that to actually decolonize health is to connect our own struggles of health organizing with struggles of indigenous people with land, with the struggles of indigenous peoples to safeguard forests and their places of livelihood. It is to connect with the struggles of indigenous people to safeguard their culture, language, and communities, and those are fundamentally about health. So, to begin with, let's sort of explore what do I mean when I talk about methods as colonial tools. I want to begin by arguing that historically, the methods of the social sciences that underlie public health have served as colonial tools, very much configured within the imperial project. So if you think about the emergence of the social sciences in the post-Cold War context, it is very much shaped within the US NATO Cold War interests of imperial expansion. And in this sense, then, questions of health often have been tied with ideas of democracy promotion and promotion of the free market, such that health, for instance, as population control or health as health promotion as family planning have very much been shaped within the colonial architectures, within the imperial architectures, promoting a construction of health that is also tied to the imperial ideology. So simultaneously as health promotion campaigns have been carried out, these campaigns have served as instruments for promotion of the free market, where sort of culture, first and foremost, has historically been erased. And then when culture in the 70s, 80s, and 90s started appearing as a concept, it started appearing as a site of surveillance, as a site to be observed, managed, mapped out, and controlled, as a category for expansion of racial capitalism. So culture as a concept itself enabled the extraction of particular characteristics of communities that can then help us design health promotion campaigns or health promotion interventions, while the voices of those communities are simultaneously silenced. Yeah. So culture becomes a tool in that sense, or an instrument in that sense, to perpetuate colonial expansion. Methods, therefore, are very much located within this imperial history as the infrastructures for the military industrial technological complex. We see this in terms of methods of gathering data, where data itself is extraction. In the words of the Maori the decolonization scholar, my friend, Professor Linda Tuhuai Smith, the author of the book Decolonizing Methodologies. Method is a dirty word for many indigenous people and for many indigenous communities, precisely because methods have historically worked to extract data out of communities in order to perpetuate colonial control. And in this sense, then, the concept of participation too, as it has been configured, has been shaped by hegemonic structures. So the terms of participation, how communities are defined and community-based participation is defined, is often within the agendas of these imperial structures in order to further perpetuate these structures. Now, in more extreme cases, as these participatory technologies have been incorporated into neoliberal technological apparatus and then have further been incorporated into sites of platform capitalism. These infrastructures have shaped the ongoing turn to populism and repression that we are seeing globally. So, what we see is an interesting paradox. On one hand, you see proliferation of platforms for participation, proliferation of the participatory rhetoric, and on the other hand, you see the ongoing consolidation of power in the hands of repressive states, ongoing military interventions, and global capital that subvert the redistributive politics and anti-colonial struggles emergent from communities. So here I'm making a critical argument that historically methods have worked to silence communities, to erase the agency of communities, and to erase the participatory capacities of communities. Now, this is often shaped by the underlying values of whiteness. Whiteness refers to the hegemonic values of white culture that are upheld, recycled, and circulated as universal. Now, the thing to note here is that across multiple global south contexts, whiteness is internalized by post-colonial elites. So in the context of India, for instance, one would argue that upper caste elites have largely co-opted these processes of whiteness and have collaborated with these structures of whiteness in order to uphold whiteness, because post-colonial elites in most instances benefit from the reproduction of whiteness, which continues to further perpetuate these inequalities. So the structural inequalities then, which means that inequalities that are shaped by the organizing systems of societies, the norms, the values that we take for granted. So values around racial capitalism, values around settler colonialism, values around caste, patriarchy, cisnormativity. These values then shape the kinds of methodological tools we perpetuate, which in turn further prop up structural inequalities. So now when we think about the social determinants of health literature and the ways in which we think of health communication campaigns that are often scripted to address these social determinants, the culture-centered critique argues that most approaches to addressing social determinants of health don't really address the social determinants because they don't address the upstream drivers of settler colonialism, capitalism, imperialism, patriarchy. They leave those intact while communities are targeted with individualized behavior change messages. So individualized behavior change in this sense becomes an infrastructure for further propping up and perpetuating structural inequalities. Here, then, I will argue that one of the key features of these structural inequalities is communicative inequality, which is the inequality in the distribution in society of communicative resources. And this lies at the heart of patriarchy, at the heart of cisnormativity, caste, settler colonialism, and imperialism. I have this image from Gaza, and if you think about both the ongoing settler colonial violence and then currently the orchestration of hunger or the orchestration of famine and food deprivation in Gaza, it is deeply intertwined with communicative inequality. In other words, violence results from communicative inequality, the inequality in the distribution and ownership of a range of communication resources, all the way from information resources, resources of representation and decision making, to voice, community participation, and participation in democracy. So communities are placed at the margins by denying their fundamental agency to participate in decision-making processes, by denying their humanity, by denying their capacity to participate in ways that are meaningful. And the ways in which this is carried out is often through communication. So you see the construction of communities as primitive, the construction of communities as backward, as sources of terror, as uncivilized, as savage, and that becomes the justificatory frame for the communicative inequality. And this communicative inequality then is at the heart of the perpetuation of imperial violence. So today we cannot talk about global health without talking about the violence of settler colonialism, imperialism, and patriarchy. We cannot talk about addressing issues of global health and decolonizing global health without addressing the specter of settler colonialism that we are facing currently, and without acknowledging the hypocrisy of the global structures that on one hand do lip service to the rhetoric of decolonization, and on the other hand absolutely are complicit in the perpetuation of the settler colonial structures, in the ongoing militarization of Israel, in the ongoing consolidation of arms in the hands of Israel, that continues to be at the heart of the perpetuation of the genocide as it unfolds in front of us. But then for those of us that have actually experienced this colonial history and have had a history of interacting with colonialism and its processes, we know that this is not new. You know, as a Bengali, for instance, my embodied or my bodily structure understands what it means, at least in terms of intergenerational trauma, to grapple with the violence of hunger and famine produced by colonialism. One only has to think about the multiple phases of the Bengal famine that goes from 1780, 1790, all the way till 1930, the Great Bengal famine. and the way in which the colonial architecture was at the heart of producing the famine. So the famine itself is artificially produced in order to hold up the colonial architecture. Now, at the heart of it, again, is this communicative inequality, which is the denial to the people at the margins of the opportunities to participate, of the opportunities to have a voice in ways that are meaningful. And the ways in which this is carried out is by framing people as less than human, by framing communities as sources of terror, by dehumanizing them in animal-like terms, by depicting them as savages and therefore incapable of participation and deserving of violence. So you think about the narrative of deservedness. So the people of Gaza deserve the violence because there are Hamas terrorists that are hiding in the hospital infrastructures of Gaza. And, one of the things that I find really powerful to grapple with within this context is the broader silence of the global health community. In fact, in one of the recent pieces that I published on decolonization and the question of genocide, I was really surprised with one of the reviews that asked this question that, how is it that, what is going on in Gaza is an issue of health? Right in the midst of a genocide that is fundamentally killing human bodies, right, where children are being deprived of fundamental ingredients of nutrition, where hospital infrastructures are being depleted, the broader taken for granted assumptions for the global health community is, what does this have to do with health? So that tells you so much about the nature of communicative inequality. So communicative inequality lies at the heart of violence, which I think should be understood as a feature of the global health disparities that we are witnessing at this juncture. In this context, I want to argue that the post-colonial elites are very much complicit in the perpetuation of this structure of power and control. So the settler colonial apparatus and the imperial apparatus works through the ongoing co-option of the post-colonial elite. So we see across post-colonial contexts where elite power and control is upheld through the ongoing erasure of the voices from the margins, where post-colonial elite gatekeepers in the Indian context, for instance, caste, work to continually create spaces of erasure. And post-colonial elites in that sense are invested in perpetuating colonial divide and rule strategies to uphold elite power. In the Indian context, for instance, I have written about Hindutva, the far-right, almost fascist ideology that continually works to co-opt the language of decolonization while actually upholding the infrastructures of whiteness as it perpetuates various forms of marginalization. So it's really important, I feel, for us to actually theorize when thinking about decolonizing methods, the ways in which post-colonial elites are complicit in upholding the methods of erasure. So whiteness then shapes the epistemology, the ways in which we think of methods, our ways of knowing the world, how we come to know the world. And this works through the interpenetrating relationship between imperialism, capitalism, and the ideologies of the platforms of data gathering through which we think of methods, right? So the individualism of methods, where questions of health are reduced to the level of the individual. Cognitivism, where health is reduced to the cognitive architectures. Linearity, the idea that, messages are processed through knowledge, attitude, behavior, the KAB model, and the linearity of that model. Or message centrism, the idea that only if you can design the right message, you can improve the health and well-being of communities at the margins. These are the epistemologies of whiteness that actually do harm by upholding the infrastructures of capitalism and imperialism and by leaving these structures intact. So at this juncture, I want to take a break after this slide and ask you a couple of questions. So in my work, what I talk about as cultural sensitivity approaches then theorize culture as a characteristic that can be incorporated into behavior change interventions in order to make these interventions more effective. These interventions, I argue, fail to address the structural drivers of poor health and in turn continue to perpetuate neoliberal expansionism by individualizing risks, that is, by locating risks at the level of the individual, by continuing to erase the structures of patriarchy, cisnormativity, imperialism, settler colonialism, and racial capitalism. And they incorporate participation to serve the status quo. Okay, so at this point, then, I would love to ask you a question, and then perhaps hear some responses before moving into the next section. And my question is, what are the ways in which, in how you have conceptualized or you have learned about health communication interventions, have you seen the concepts of racial capitalism, settler colonialism, and imperialism play out? My question again is, how have you, in your exposure to health communication campaigns or interventions, seen the concepts of settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and imperialism play out? I would love to hear any thoughts.
Okay, the participants, the chat is open. You may drop your thoughts. Okay, yeah. So, in response to Professor Datta's question, so please feel free. Professor Datta, would you like to repeat the question maybe, in case they didn't get it?
Yeah. So, what are the ways in which, in your exposure to health communication interventions, or how you think of health communication interventions, have you seen these concepts of racial capitalism, settler colonialism, and imperialism play out? I'm going to write it down. Aftab said that it's almost unseen. Fuhaid said that we have seen a lot of these concepts in Western media. Yeah. Christopher said campaigns focused on telling, little of no participation of community. Arindam says when we go to indigenous communities with research tools designed globally, also when we do not invite co-creation from communities. Beautiful.
Keep dropping your comments, please. Please keep them coming. Yeah.
More spending on marketing and TV campaigns, absolutely, which actually are part of the neoliberal apparatus that keeps that apparatus intact. Lesser participation, in fact, no participation of the marginalized sections while designing the tools. Yes. Majority of budget spent on foreign consultants, exactly. Foreign consultants that can come in, spend 10 days in the community and then instruct the community on how to adopt healthy behaviors, yeah? I often talk about the elite university model where you have sort of academic tourism that is promoted, in fact, where elite academics go into a community, spend a week or 10 days without knowing the language or the culture, and then give prescriptions to the community on how to create interventions.
And that is very much prevalent in global health.
Yes. I mean, that's one of my critiques of. Yeah, go ahead, Professor Satpathy.
No, in fact, if you look at it, they send their students for 1 month training program, some sort of visiting, like cultural tourism, basically, nothing more, you know. And they go to another country, and then they start claiming that we are experts in Kenya, South Africa, Ethiopia, India, and everything. Literally, sometimes they don't even visit. They sit in the heart of England or Harvard. I mean, I don't want to name any institution. Literally, Boston, and claim that they are experts in everything. So
yes,
that happens quite often.
Yes, and in this context, we also need to think of the funding sources. So if you think about USAID, for instance, or DFID, United States Agency for International Development, or the British Development Fund, these are often part of the imperial architecture. And we need to really think of these development agencies and their shaping of health as development agenda within that context of imperial power and control. We also need to think of foundations like the Gates Foundation or foundations like the Carnegie Foundation within this context, and really ask the question, to what extent do foundations perpetuate structural violence? Particularly when you think of Gates Foundation and the other part of its infrastructure, which is techno capital and platform capitalism, then that critique is really important in terms of thinking through the agendas of the foundation and how it constructs this question of global health and what it means by global health when it sets the agenda of global health.
But Professor Datta, the Gates Foundation is no longer having two sides of the coin. Now it is married together. The techno-capitalism has married global health already. Now
Yes.
It's primarily focusing on food security, agriculture, women's and children's health, and technology, AI, integration. And now they have married it all together, thanks to the ever emerging role of artificial intelligence. Everyone is also saying it's a great move. So that is going to determine a lot of what we are going to see in the next few years, at least in our lifetimes.
That's a beautiful example, Professor Satpathy. And I think the question related to that, and I will go through the question of agriculture and food, is what does it mean in terms of indigenous communities, indigenous livelihoods, indigenous sovereignty, control over food systems, when so much of the global agenda around the narrative of food insecurity has been consolidated in the hands of platform capital, right? So to the extent that Gates Foundation is determining national and global policy agendas, and you powerfully point out, the AI context in terms of, say, incorporation of food systems into platform capital and systems of speculation on platforms, there are real implications for what it means for hunger and food insecurity and poverty in communities of the global South,
Do you want to ask more questions? Okay. Yeah, please.
I just want to read out a couple more. Use of former colonizers' language in most health messages, absolutely. Debating about sensitive issues in high-tech environment with no empathy for the real-world scenario. Manisha, that's a great point. And also with real implications for surveillance, right? So when you think about techno-capital and platform capital, we are all turned into data. And you're seeing the implications of that with the far right, with the Trump administration in the US, but you see the implications of that in India consistently in terms of activists and dissenting voices being surveilled through social media and then being targeted through social media. So it also is an interesting question in terms of what are the spaces of resistance, what are the spaces of dissent, and what are the spaces of communities speaking back, going back to this question of communicative inequalities. So are platforms further perpetuating communicative inequalities, or are they mitigating them? And in fact, in much of my work, I argue that platform capital is one of the most critical instruments in the current context that carries out various forms of erasure, and the genocide in Gaza is a powerful exemplar of that. So Arindam's question is funding a way of colonialism. I will get to this question in terms of addressing structural determinants of health. Can social change communication projects be funded? Is social change really funded, or it's a question, right? There is some beautiful theoretical work that suggests that the revolution will not be funded, right? That when communities participate in active processes of change, that doesn't come through these funding structures that are invested in perpetuating themselves. So what is the hope for global health? And the culture-centered approach tries to grapple with that question that I will go with the next set of slides. Okay, I will wrap up with this other point that Ifeanyi Francis Merenini talks about social stratification and cultural ethnic diversity needs to be considered, absolutely. And connected to that then is the communicative inequality, right? So with stratification of societies, we need to ask the questions, who is setting up the rules, who is participating, and who is being erased from the discursive spaces of knowledge generation. And, with my work in the context of Adivasi or indigenous health, one of the things that I often find quite striking is that the people that are doing the pontification and theorizing of indigenous health are upper caste people like me, or privileged caste, privileged people like me, and hardly Adivasi people and Adivasi academics. And I think that's a really powerful question in terms of who is setting up the rules of the game, and how do we go about changing those rules if we are really committed to addressing these structural inequalities. If it's okay, I will move to the next set of slides.
Yeah, Professor Datta, you may resume your training, and after 15-20 minutes, we'll take a break, during which it will be bathroom break, come questions. So I'll pick up few questions from the Q&A and we can answer them.
Okay,
so maybe please keep putting questions in the Q&A section only, not in the chat. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so Professor Satpathy, in about 15 minutes, we take a break?
Yes, about 15 minutes.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay. So the culture-centered approach then grapples with this question: what does it mean to build transformative spaces for social change where communities can own the systems and spaces of organizing communication? And within that context, then the question becomes one of how do communities dismantle the structures that threaten health and well-being? And how do we turn toward co-creating alternative structures? That's why I love the framing of your organizing as alt, because I'm really interested in that question of the alt, which is how do communities co-create alternative structures that are rooted in redistributive commitments, that are rooted in commitments to socialist politics, which means that fundamentally transforming the political and economic means of production, fundamentally transforming health with the idea that health is a public good, is a public resource, and therefore ought to be organized around socialist principles. And connected to that, then, the communicative resources are also public resources that ought to be organized around socialist principles, where we really need to think through how do we equally distribute these resources in society such that everyone can participate. And that is the basis of my experiments with radical democracy, or what I call radical democracy, where communities own those spaces of voice and decision making through which they can fundamentally transform how we think of and imagine health. So, I've done quite a lot of work with communities growing their own food, around food sovereignty. I've done quite a bit of work around communities creating their own healthcare infrastructures, including preventive resources that are anchored in and owned by community. And in those questions, context, an important question is how do we redistribute those systems of caring for health as well as those systems of participation and decision making so that communities own those decision making spaces. So in this context, an invitation to decolonize is also an invitation to situate knowledge in communities as spaces of struggle. So we cannot produce decolonizing health communication knowledge in the ivory tower separate from communities. One has to, the culture-centered approach is an invitation for us to move beyond the ivory tower in communities and in solidarity with communities, to see ourselves in struggles and in people's struggles, to see ourselves in social movements led by and driven by those who have historically been disenfranchised and silenced, to see ourselves within activist interventions. So within interventions that seek to fundamentally challenge, resist, and dissent against these structures, and in everyday performances of community life. So decolonization is not a journal article. Decolonization is not this lecture, but decolonization, in the words of Professor Graham Hingangaroa Smith, one of the founders of Kaupapa Maori theory, one of the leading decolonizing theories of the social sciences more broadly, is that every work of theory is rooted in and is evident in the calluses on our hands, which suggests that if we really look at the transformative power of theory, we have to look at the ways in which we ourselves have been able to embed us and our bodies in people's struggles, in building these spaces for just health and these alternative infrastructures. So for the culture-centered approach, then, the question becomes, how do we work alongside communities in solidarity with communities? Solidarity meaning working alongside in friendships. The idea of solidarity suggests an aspiration to horizontality of relationships, of course, noting that academics inherently bring power with us in terms of the highly unequal terrains. The question then becomes one of how do we learn to continually work at this power, continually undo it while actually drawing from the positive aspects of the power to co-create these voice infrastructures, these spaces where communities can express their voices. And voice infrastructures are resources through which communities express their agency, their capacities to make sense of their everyday lives, to hold knowledge and to act on the basis of this knowledge. So knowledge exists in the everyday, drawing upon culture and cultural resources, recognizing that all knowledge claims, including knowledge claims of capital S science, are embedded in specific cultural contexts. That recognition, however, is not an invitation for us to go anti-science, but that recognition is for us to then think about the ways in which we build bridges when considering, for instance, indigenous knowledge systems. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, we talk about Mataranga Maori, which is knowledge owned by, shaped by, ancestrally derived by Maori. In fact, Maori have powerful systems of knowledge generation around astronomy. So Mataranga Maori astronomy is a powerful example of how indigenous knowledge builds bridges with science to express agency, but also to create alternative structures, structures that are not rooted in those epistemologies of whiteness. Remember, cognitivism, linearity, reductionism, but in epistemologies of love, of connection, of seeing the humanity of each other. So the culture-centered method then works through this idea of building advisory groups in communities, these advisory groups themselves being spaces of knowledge generation. Now, this work of building advisory groups is itself ethnographic in nature, such that community organizers from within communities, um, researchers from within communities, both as insiders as well as outsiders, first observe what are the spaces of erasure and work through that process to build these spaces where community members can broadly participate, addressing and pointing to the intersectional drivers of marginalization. So very much different from how CBPR, for instance, conceptualizes advisory groups as representatives of NGOs. The CCA says that the very act of building advisory groups has returned to the question of the margins of the margins. Which voices are at the margins of the community, and how do we invite those voices in? And that's why that ethnographic component, both as insider and outsider, is really important in terms of being able to understand the terrains and the textures of communication and community. That becomes then a way for communities to create research design through image making, through digital storytelling, through crafting of poetry, through indigenous art forms. I just use photo voice as a placeholder, but really what I mean is through multimodal forms of methods and of knowledge generation that are more attuned to community life. And that becomes the way for shaping conversations, for shaping dialogue. So I've used this box called in-depth interviews, but in-depth interviews are much broader within the context of CCA, in that sense that the culture-centered approach offers us an invitation to decolonize what we understand as in-depth interviews, to instead think of dialogues where researchers themselves also become subjects of that dialogic process, who can be asked questions. And in that sense, communities can hold researchers and must hold researchers and academics accountable. So through that process of co-creation, advisory groups then configure strategies of change that they then determine based on meetings with various and diverse stakeholders in terms of how that change process is organized to seek to transform the structural determinants of health. So let me turn to this question of communities, because communities is often a black box when we carry out community-based research. And the CCA invites us to think of communities as deeply unequal spaces, as spaces where power, control are negotiated. And so in that sense, when you think of working with communities to co-identify material resources, to co-create voice infrastructures where community voices can be heard, to co-identify spaces of support, and how to safeguard these infrastructures, co-creating material and symbolic interventions to drive structural interventions. It is important to think about who makes up the community, but also which are the voices being heard in the community and which are the voices being erased in the community. So this idea that communities themselves are not homogeneous spaces, that communities themselves are heterogeneous, and how then do we learn to listen to those voices in community that are systematically erased? So the next task for each one of us is to think through what is our community. How do we identify the communities that we belong to? So describe the communities I belong to. Who is or are my community? Because as researchers, part of debunking the invisibility of the academic is by making visible who the academic is. So it is in this sense good for us to think through who is our my community, what is or are my accountabilities to the communities I belong to, who is or are the communities I'm engaging with in my method, and what is or are my accountabilities to the communities I'm working with. So I'm going to ask you to think through these questions and perhaps start putting these in the chat. Let's go through that and then let's take a break. I'm going to keep the screen up so that you can see the questions I've posted here. Do you need me to share the screen again?
Yes, that would be great, so that they can see participants. So whatever Professor Datta is asking, you may respond to that in the chat. Chats are open. So, yeah. Let's have the more participation, more active participation. That would be great. You will enjoy the process of learning them. Only respond to these questions in the chat. Thank you. Please be quick. After this, we'll take a short break of 10 minutes, during which you can relax, and also we'll take a few questions from the Q&A. So what Professor Datta is asking you to do is basically, like acknowledging your own identities, own privileges. We call it also positionality statement. Yes, it is based on everything in the yes, correct. You can drop in the chat the responses to these questions which are posted on the screen, and we can then move.
Beautiful. So, Arindam, you've asked whether it is your language, profession, caste, culture. Let's just take one example, the example of language, how language itself that creates communicative inequalities in terms of who belongs and who doesn't. Yeah. When I work in Adivasi contexts, how often am I sort of imposing my linguistic norms around Bengali, for instance, to participate in dialogue, rather than, say, when working with Santali's Olchiki, which is the Santali language, and what does that say about the colonial history of Adivasi disenfranchisement, including the post-colonial history of Adivasi disenfranchisement, right? And then the question becomes, how does one work through that kind of power inequality? Portia, you mentioned your place of origin, marriage, the church you go to, professional fellowship and workplace, now also the global alt. Yeah, those are beautiful. Professionalization itself, the professions, what are the expectations and accountabilities they create regarding community, right? But also what are the kinds of erasures they create through that process. I find that to be interesting. Farzana, it's a beautiful thing you have suggested about, your research question and study population. It is varied from tribal or healthcare provider of the tribal people or under 5 children. So these are great. And then the question within that articulation becomes, what is the relationality and accountability to the tribal communities that you're working with. In fact, the setting up of tribal communities as communities to engage with itself reflects a particular power differential, right? So we choose as academics, so I choose as an academic of caste privilege to engage with tribal communities. What does that then bring into the power dynamic in terms of communicative inequalities? I love this thing. What one of you pointed out, Manisha, in terms of your own identity. And then you say, I've rarely worked with my own community. And that's really, really powerful. So the way in which the epistemology of whiteness works is that we are always in search of the other, the cultural other as the community to be put under the scanner and to be worked with, while hardly do we think of the communities of place that we belong to and how we engage with those communities. So in that sense, one of you earlier pointed out, caste privilege itself becomes invisible in terms of the ways in which research methodologies get shaped. And one of the critical questions in this sense is that if you're working in caste-based contexts, then rather than eliciting, and I have heard this often from communities negotiating caste oppression, that rather than working with or listening to the voices of caste oppressed communities, it becomes really important to think of how do we build or co-create voice infrastructures where communities can participate, A, but B, how do we dismantle the casteism of the structures within our own communities that we come from? So what happens when the lens is turned around? Shepo Patrick Mukherjee, beautiful. My community consists of about 700,000 population located in mining area with different health disparities such as disease burden perpetuated by migrant labor system. My role is mostly health promotion and prevention of disease through public health advocacy. That's beautiful. So then the question is, how do you negotiate power and control? The power that comes with your positionality vis-a-vis the power and control negotiated by migrant laborers, and what does it mean in that sense to turn that accountability to the migrant laborers? Portia, thank you for saying this. My accountability is to share the public health information and advice for improving interpersonal relations for healthier living, and now to revisit the knowledge and resilience systems within the communities to promote their health. Absolutely. So connected to this, then the question is, how do you take this to the next level of structural accountability, particularly when communities point to the ways in which these interpersonal relationships are located in relationship to broader structures, and how then does health advocacy turn toward challenging these structures? Yes, Hene, beautiful. Important to recognize that our communities are not a monolith, and that recognition allows us to work in an honest way. Yes, yes, yes. Beautiful. Aftab, you have shared that I'm working with Chantal and Garos. I'm looking communication risk factors for health disparity among them. This is beautiful. So then the question is also, what is your community? What is your positionality? How does that positionality shape then your relationship with Chantals and Garos?
So we can take a break, Professor Dattana.
Yes. Let's go ahead and take a break. This is beautiful. Thank you for this conversation, and we will pick up from here when we come back.
Yes, we'll take a short break of 2-3 minutes, and after that we'll be using the rest of the break time, 10 minutes, to read a few questions and respond to it. Thank you. So those who need a break, they may use it. 2 minutes break. We shall reconvene. There are hardly very few questions, so you can take some of them during this time. I think you took one question already. So right now, are you in New Zealand or in Singapore?
I'm in New Zealand, Professor Satpathy.
Okay, yeah, because I get confused very often, you know. No, we are very happy to have you today because I wanted to invite you for quite some time. But I think it's also a very good end to the GACP training programs because we started on a very high-end note of different technology. Initial sessions were on decolonization, African health systems, and many other things. Like Professor Lucio from African Population Health Research Center, the head of international programs, joined us. Then several top professors, academics from all over the world, and different topics, different areas of global health, public health, mental health, other areas were discussed. And today we are ending on something very critical, and I think, yeah, very needed also. Many times we don't talk about it. We just, rug it under the carpet. We forget these. We don't think. Uh, Even those who claim that they care, they don't actually sufficiently acknowledge them in their work and practice. It's something my unbiased observation.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. It's beautiful to be in this conversation, and also, to see the huge diversity of the contexts and the comments from the participants is beautiful.
Yes, today we have a little less participation in terms of numbers, but I think the quality of participation still remains very vibrant. So I'm happy with it. Usually, the public health people are trained to think in a particular way, like engage with more data, infectious disease, and all those kind of things, not with these softer aspects, the most critical aspects of public health.
Mm.
So I'm just being respectful to the learning needs of the participants also. But I think as we move ahead and how we are navigating global health as a field, I think we need to not just talk about them on the surface level. We need to dissect them properly and need to do some justice to that also in terms of practice, not just in terms of writing good quality papers in BMJ and Lancet. We should be taking it forward in the form of real practice. Can we change things? And in
Yeah,
fact, this is
and thank
something.
you. Yeah, thank you
Sorry.
for saying this.
Yeah. And no, all my life I have always wondered when will we be able to generate any real change on the planet? And that question has always led me. In fact, actually, I'm day before yesterday on a live call on recording. I was telling my participants, training participants, that academia is the most fraudulent profession on earth. So I was a little frustrated with how academia works, you know, in terms of this operation and practices. So there are things which I think they need urgent remediation. Otherwise, we will not be able to move as a discipline or as a profession making any significant impact on the society. The behavior. Because, for example, I was so passionately engaged with the Gaza episode, especially. You know, there were 3 months, the first 3 months, I did not sleep and eat well at all. I was engaged on Twitter for the entire duration. And you will not believe, after 1.5 years of fighting with it, they deleted my profile from Twitter because I kept fighting against it every day, every single day. And it used to catch a lot of attention, a lot of traction in terms of traffic. So they just deleted my profile without any notice, without any violation, nothing. Just next day morning I get up, it's not there.
Yeah.
And I wrote, I didn't even write to them because I felt like I knew why they did it. So.
And this is exactly what I mean by communicative inequality, isn't it? That, that platform capital holds the power. So when we talk about tech and AI, it holds the power to shape that discursive space,
They think they have a power to suppress our voices, but like I believe in myself being Trunamul, the grassroots. Like I'll always
Yes.
rise up every time you try to suppress us, cut us down. We'll rise up every time. So I believe in that theory, and I believe in me being that. So we can take a few questions. There are some good questions for you in the chat. Whichever you like, you can take them up, or I can read them for you.
Can you read them for me?
Okay, great. Arindam is asking, are the pharmaceutical structures have colonialism embedded in them? I mean, how gynec issues of the communities can be treated only in ways or with drugs designed by the developed world?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So at a broader level, of course, the pharmaceutical infrastructure is very much established within the racial capitalist colonial imperial apparatus. Having said that, that it's also important to recognize here sort of the architectures of global south resistance, global south innovation with open science, and the sort of work at creating alternative public infrastructures, as well as easily accessible, much more easily accessible infrastructures for the production of pharmaceutical remedies and solutions. The other part of it that you point out is how sort of the biomedical approaches to sexual health and to family health can be complemented with other indigenous knowledge systems. And then again, I think within that context is important when thinking through decolonizing registers about how we build bridges. And bridges suggest not just taking one or the other. In fact, in my ongoing work, what I've found is quite interesting. For many Santalis in rural parts of Bengal, the challenge is not one of not wanting to take biomedical medicine. In fact, the challenge is not having access to decent biomedical healthcare. And within that context and in that backdrop, then there is also the uses of indigenous healing traditions and practices. So one of the things that it teaches me, at least, is sort of this polymorphic approach to health, where multiple approaches can exist in dialogue and in conversation with each other.
Right. Although the field of bioethics claims that we have moved quite long way ahead of Henrietta Lacks in 1920s, 30s, but I don't think we have actually made a lot of changes in terms of how we understand, recognize, and address the issues of intersectionalities in global health and public health. So that is one of the biggest challenges. Like if you means you live in the West for quite a long time now, so you know how the hypocrisy represents and manifests itself in several subtle forms. And I think you are quite a vocal advocate against that also. So I keep reading the books and I feel very happy. At least there is someone who is fighting, because I'm not privileged enough to live in the West for past few years. I've been living in India now. So, and I'm quite happy with that. Honestly, I really don't need to live in London to be there or to do any work. At least I'm happy. I'm at home doing something meaningful, hopefully. Yeah. So there are two more questions by another person named Musha Uba Hashim. He is asking, what is the primary focus of a culture-centered approach to health communication? And second is, how does a culture-centered approach to health communication address the issue of power dynamics in healthcare interaction, particularly in contexts where there are significant cultural and socio-economic disparities between healthcare providers and patients?
What great questions. I will take up these questions together. So the primary focus of the culture-centered approach is sort of to undo and radically transform the power inequalities that we went through in the first part of the presentations. And it proposes to do so by talking about how this work of these methods of co-creating voice infrastructures. So precisely what you're talking about, power and control, it works through those concepts of power and control to partner with communities to build voice infrastructures where communities can actually make decisions, build the kinds of health infrastructures that are meaningful to them, that can include all the way from building community gardens for food to community-owned drinking water systems to healthcare infrastructures, and to the level of advocating the state and the structures of the state to create public health and public distribution systems that serve the interests of communities at the margins. So really at the crux of it, it is about building these voice infrastructures through which these unequal terrains of power and control can be resisted.
Yeah. So there are two questions which are the same in fact, but they are phrased in different ways. Arindam is saying, is funding a way of colonialism? It means, is it a manifestation of it? And Ochen Walter Arnold is asking, is funding an act of colonialism?
So funding is deeply intertwined with the colonial project. At least that's what the history of funding teaches us. And particularly in terms of states and capitals setting the agenda of funding, what is to be funded and how it is to be funded. Having said that, I want to acknowledge that for many grassroots struggles, funding becomes a critical way through which they're able to secure access to health, and funding is tied to health in that sense. So the question there is, with regard to the decolonization, then how can these funding infrastructures be fundamentally transformed such that indigenous communities, communities at the margins of the global south, migrant workers, refugees, actually get to participate in the processes as meaningful developers of solutions. So it's to radically transform how funding is done and what it does. And again, I see beautiful examples of that in New Zealand with the thriving Maori economy, because, here in New Zealand, we have something called Te Tiriti that was signed by Maori, the indigenous people, and the British Crown as a contract. And what that essentially means is that Maori get to have a say because of Te Tiriti on funding structures. Now, that is coming under attack from various forms of white supremacy, and it has been under attack. But nevertheless, that teaches us a model of decolonization where the very architectures, the logics of funding are shaped by community participation and ownership.
Right. Right. So I think we can now resume the training because 15 minutes break is over.
Great.
Participants, we shall take the next set of questions at the end of the training. Okay, so please keep posting your questions in the Q&A section, and we shall take them under. Yes, Professor Dutta. Thank you.
So next, I will go to the nuts and bolts of the culture-centered method, and I think for the rest of the presentation, and I'm looking at the time, I want to sort of wrap up with talking exactly about the nuts and bolts of the method and how we go about developing culture-centered health communication solutions. So the first step of the method then, in terms of making spaces for the unheard, if we sort of have acknowledged conceptually that marginalization and disenfranchisement in health is a product of erasure and communicative inequality, then the question becomes one of how do we listen to the voices that are systematically erased. So there are three questions that guide the culture-centered method. First is, noting that communities, like you pointed out, are not homogeneous spaces, that communities themselves are heterogeneous. They are sites of power and control and differential power and control. So attending to that then, and finding ways of teasing that out becomes important in methods. So asking who is not present in this space, which voices are not reflected here, are not being heard here. And then the third question, how can we invite those voices in? Those are real important steps for the culture-centered approach, because they suggest a sort of relationality, a form of deep reflexivity that seeks to listen for the traces and erasure. And particularly when we are constructing communities as data. And data can be any form of data. It can be participant observation, it can be qualitative, interview-based or focus group, or it can be quantitative, be survey, large-scale survey design, or longitudinal surveys or experiments. The questions to consider is, how is this data configured? How is this data serving extractive purposes? And which voices are not being heard here? And then the question becomes for us, how do we turn the tables on their head? How do we learn to listen to those voices such that we can invite those voices in? Not so that we can then design the space, but such that those voices can be the owners of that decision-making process. Mind you what I'm saying, such that those voices can be owners of the decision-making processes. So the work I do with Adivasis, for instance, it fundamentally starts from the question of indigenous health and Adivasi health, and it has gradually moved into the work of co-creating with Adivasis language schools and cultural schools, because learning how to have a say in democratic decision-making processes through these language schools at the grassroots and the margins is fundamental to reshaping the configuration of health. So this is our work with women farmers, Dalit women farmers who are organized in Sanghams in Telangana under the umbrella of the Deccan Development Society. This is a long-term collaboration of care where the women's collective decision-making on what food to grow in the backdrop of the neoliberal onslaught of agriculture, articulating a concept of food sovereignty that is deeply embedded in seed sovereignty, this idea that communities are owners of seeds in the collective, seeds not to be owned and privatized in the networks of racial capitalism, but seeds as everyday acts of living being that are connected to nature and ecosystem as public goods to be widely distributed and shared, shows the theory generative capacities of communities. So the women participating in these decision-making processes are actually generating theories of agriculture, food generation, and health. So this idea of regenerative agriculture as the basis of health also is tied to this idea of a regenerative democracy in the backdrop of the ongoing expulsion of farmers, particularly poor farmers, particularly women farmers and laborers, from these spaces of decision making around agriculture, what food to grow, as agriculture has become increasingly technologized by platform capital and AI capital, becomes a way for radically owning democracies and developing pedagogies of democracy. So here you see what the women are doing. They have these chalks with which they have planned out and mapped out the fields that they collectively own in the Sangam, and they are planning collectively what crops to grow in the different fields so that the soil is regenerative and it fixes the nitrogen in the soil rather than depleting the nitrogen. So it's a powerful exemplar of community held knowledge, which is the crux of the culture-centered approach as the basis of regaining health as a decolonizing register through the everyday participation in radical democracy. So knowledge in community then turns to these three questions. Who owns the infrastructure of knowledge? So what does it mean for communities to own the infrastructures of knowledge? Not us as mediators, but as communities to own them. How does that ownership shape the nature of claims, the knowledge claims being made? And here you see the knowledge claims being made by the women around Bij Swatantra, which is seed sovereignty, is fundamentally transformative of how we think of seeds as commodities, to be transacted by global biotech. How does ownership shape the material solutions that are generated? So this idea that seeds are not to be owned, but seeds belong to the common, to be shared openly. So they run a seed bank through which they openly share the seeds, and then for anyone that wants to give back to the seed bank, they just bring the seeds in. Becomes a powerful exemplar of disrupting privilege. So in this context, it's important as health communication scholars or public health scholars, for us to think through how we disrupt the privileges of the epistemologies we inhabit. What are the privileges I enjoy? What are the sources of my privilege? And what are the ways in which my privilege reproduces power? So this idea that we are complicit within these colonial structures is an important and humbling recognition, particularly in terms of the ways in which our privileges reproduce these global power structures. So the work of building voice infrastructures, and this is from our work in rural Bengal, where women participate to build these spaces of radical democracy, including designing women's health spaces, children's education spaces for learning Santali language, for spaces of cultural performance. They create what we call these voice infrastructures, which are systems, platforms, norms, and processes through which communities can express their voices, share their stories, share their knowledge, and participate in decision making. That's one of the most important concepts in here, which is the creation of the spaces for communities to participate in decision making. So the culture-centered approach, and this is the question that one of you asked, what is it fundamentally concerned about as a health communication framework? It is interested in this question of how do we build voice infrastructures in communities at the margins by inverting the dominant structures of meaning making. So we fundamentally have to disrupt the taken for granted assumptions, which is the basis for disrupting the ideologies of settler colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism. And by disrupting the dominant structures of meaning making, do we build alt spaces, spaces for other ways of imagining and being in the world. So co-creative process, first and foremost, it acknowledges that working with community is also about working through unequal terrains of power. So when we say co-create, it doesn't mean that academics come in and say, oh, we are going to go into a community and start working together and co-create. Well, before we get there, it's really important for us to think through the kind of unequal terrains of power and the logics of power we bring into communities, and how are we going to work to decenter that power. So what does it mean for communities to own these voice infrastructures? And connected to that is the question of who is the community. How do we develop habits of patient listening to an ethic of the other that is always open to listening with humility, and that is continually decentering, that is inviting indifference and embodying solidarity as an act of being with community, as a basis for working toward other imaginations, where solidarity is not a performative buzzword, but it is a practice of showing up. And this is most fundamental. I've consistently found this in my own work, which is that the work of solidarity is being able to respond with our bodies when they are called upon by communities at the margins to show up. The practices of showing up when the struggle gets going, when the movement gets going, to really ask this question of what does it mean to have long-term commitment. And this is where, your question about is funding a colonial system? In many ways it is. That's why we think of communities as projects, that we spend 2, 3, 4 years, at the most 5 years, and then we move on to find another project in another community. And that itself is an extractive habit that perpetuates power, control, mistrust. So how do we bring long-term commitments and relationships? And what does it mean to then see these relationships in local global connections? So I work with the women farmers under the Deccan Development Society is also one of seeing and witnessing how the women farmers build networks of seed growing, particularly growing climate resilient and climate adaptive crops, working with other women farmers in other parts of the world, in Africa, in Latin America, and building networks like the millet network that they have built. So this act of building voice infrastructures turns to this concept of communicative sovereignty, which is communities having the capacity to tell their own stories, to produce their own knowledge. So we see this in the context of the Gaza conflict, in terms of the ways in which the very architectures of global health are disrupted through the presence of these voices from Gaza, through these presence of everyday voices of journalists that account and witness the genocide and create communicative resources that narrate the stories of colonial terror. So in this sense, accountability itself is transferred and transformed from our academic spaces, from our global associations to communities at the margins. It's a way for rewiring and redoing our own commitments, where these commitments are turned toward the communities that we engage with, such that the registers for accountability and governance are built through the participation of voices at the margins. These processes of building culture-centered methods of voice infrastructures are rooted in collectivization. The collectivization expressed as sovereignty of communities and ecosystems, articulating collective rights. Remember how we talked about the epistemology of whiteness that constructs health at the level of the individual and risk at the level of individuals. So challenging that by articulating collective rights to ecosystems, to land, to the planetary infrastructure. And this becomes a way for disrupting authoritarian erasures across the globe, with the rise of authoritarian power and control, which is a significant threat to public health. The way of grappling against that is by turning to collectivization and processes of collectivization that Global South and indigenous communities have often found recourse in. And that becomes also a way for decentering the surveillance structures of data capital, platform capital, and global tech in that sense. So these voice infrastructures, I will now wrap up with a few exemplars of our work. This is our work embedded in Maori land struggles, where for Maori, health is theorized as rooted in land. Now, what that translates into then is, remember how I talked about showing up, that fundamentally showing up as health organizers or health activists in land occupations that resist the colonial confiscation of indigenous land. It's about anchoring these voice infrastructures in sovereignty, where communities enact their sovereignty. In New Zealand, Maori talk about Tinuranga Tiratanga, which means the sovereignty of indigenous people over their resources and land. And here in this work with community kai or community-led food gardens, which is a fundamental way of reorganizing health, you see one of our community organizers, Aunt Selina, say, when whanau meaning family, collectivize and lead food organizing by connecting to ancestral land. Wairua means our spirits and bodies are nourished. So you see the integration of spirits and bodies, hearts are filled and our minds are sparked with future possibilities and reimagining. So you see, we talked about sovereignty over land and connected to the land. That land becomes the space then for growing food, which is what indigenous people have often done in multiple contexts, which is to work on these lands to grow food, to share and to build a community and to connect with the broader ecosystem. Here you see again this concept of sovereignty enacted by the women farmers, in DDS, where they take these seeds in the seed banks and they go in these processions singing songs from village to village, distributing seeds and singing the songs of the seed, where songs become a way of reenacting health through the story of the seed. Community, here you see on bullock carts, the women carrying the seeds as they sing the songs. These become a way of disrupting also the erasure of their voices. So songs disrupt the colonial architectures of erasure through these voice infrastructures. So when you ask, what do you mean by voice infrastructure? Here you have multiple examples of voice infrastructures. You have those bullock carts carrying the seed banks. You have the women and the children singing the songs of the seed. And then you have the collective of the broader procession going through the villages. Here you see the women singing to the seeds as a way of waking up the seeds. And this process of waking up the seeds is about rejuvenating health and well-being. And it is fundamentally anchored in redistributive commitments. This idea that health is fundamentally about resisting the capitalist consolidation and privatization of life forms. It is to articulate and materialize a political economy that resists colonial capitalist extraction by sustaining and regenerating community ownership of life forms. So this is a fundamental architecture of decolonial resistance, which is anti-colonial. We often forget when talking about decolonial, and almost suggesting that it is, some kind of cultural essence, that decolonial is fundamentally about resisting capitalism, that it is about articulating an anti-colonial politics that is socialist in its fundamental imaginary. And it is materially grounded. So this is where you see, like I was sharing with you the work that we do with in the Adivasi context of Bengal, of building these spaces for learning. So this is a school for Santali language, building these spaces for learning, which becomes the space for imagining the pedagogies for building the next generation of health researchers, of community researchers, who someday will sort of be able to talk about indigenous health without needing interlocutors like us. So part of this, in the words of Gayatri Spivak, for instance, is to make the caste privileged narrator redundant in the telling of the story, such that communities tell the story of their knowledge system in their own words, owning these infrastructures. These struggles, these methods of voice and voice infrastructure are rooted in the body. This is, I talk about the Palestinian poet and academic Rifat Al-Arir, who was murdered, much like many academics in Gaza who were murdered, in what's called as scholasticide, the destruction of the knowledge and intellectual infrastructure of Gaza. And within that context, the body in decolonizing spaces becomes an architecture for telling a story, and through the work of witnessing, for building a knowledge system as a storyteller. And in this sense, it dismantles the scriptocentrism as the script-based, data-based ways for us to think through theory, by actually looking at theory as embodied, as practiced, as having to live in the everyday. I will wrap up with sort of a few key points of this. The struggle for decolonization is one about fundamentally centering joy here. Is sort of the ongoing anti-racist struggles of Maori here in Aotearoa. I had the humble, openings or invitations for participating in these struggles, in conversations. And one of the most beautiful things I note in these struggles is the ways in which songs, dances that celebrate joy become way of standing against the white supremacy of colonialism, or standing against the reductionism and cognitivism of whiteness, by building spaces for crafting hope. Hope is what often indigenous traditions talk about as ways of sustaining knowledge, by recognizing the impossibilities of dialogue with whiteness, but at the same time, through songs, dances, stories, by building alternative registers, by centering aroha, as Maori talk about, or the values of love as ways of connecting health and well-being. Here I had a campaign from a piece of health communication work we did with transgender activists around transgender health, but I don't think you would be able to hear this because some of the sound sharing is not working. So I will share these slides with Professor Satpathy, and hopefully you'll have a chance to watch some of the videos. And by fundamentally reimagining democracies, learning the ways in which democracies create erasures and silences is also an opportunity for reimagining democracies by organizing for constitutional transformation rooted in the voices of the margins, based on indigenous and global South knowledge systems, and building within community and public pedagogy spaces for alternative knowledge systems. So I will wrap up with the digital. I know we started by talking about decolonizing these architectures, and we started by talking about techno capital, and I want to uh, wrap up by talking about techno capital. So this is also an opening for us to reimagine digital spaces, for reimagining technological futures, AI futures rooted in ideas of justice. And I find the concept of voice infrastructures offers a powerful way for us to think about technologies by centering community ownership, by centering questions of justice and data, and by centering questions of sovereignty in terms of who owns the data, how do communities create architectures for owning the data and resist the ongoing extraction of data from them. How do communities own these knowledge infrastructures and resist their extraction? How do communities anchor these digital spaces in struggles for justice and in socialist commitments? And then how do these spaces seed hope and imagination? Because it is, after all, at the end, our capacity to imagine that will sustain our ability to build alternative worlds, alternative local, global public health systems. Um, I want to, you asked this question about funding as colonialism, and part of that is that the ways in which colonial architectures, by creating an economy of permission, have shaped how we think of our own scholarship as public health and health communication scholars. So part of interrogating that privilege is learning how we reject the politics of clientelism, dependence on funding agencies, funding infrastructures, and the metrics that are established by these structures. And even as I say this, I note that I myself am sort of co-opted into these metrics. So I think that's an ongoing question for how we reject the trickle-down forms of organizing resources and communities. And then, one of the things that we have noticed with our work is that on an ongoing basis, when you build voice infrastructures in the margins and they create powerful sites of resistance, the powerful, of course, are going to turn back, and they're going to respond, and they're going to seek to silence these structures. So how do we also create spaces of sustenance by building hidden voice infrastructures so that these voice infrastructures can hide as needed in the face of repression, so that they can go undetected by the hegemonic structures? And while when fascism or authoritarian repression takes on full form, how do these voice infrastructures develop habits of patiently waiting in those subterranean spaces as zones as they wait for the openings? So I will wrap up by saying that decolonizing global health from the framework of the culture-centered approach is fundamentally about weaving our collective futures by turning to voice infrastructures as the ways through which we can build radical democracies. Thank you.
What a power-packed presentation. So, what a power-packed presentation. So I was just listening to that, and I was hoping and sort of looking for, like, is he going to speak more? Like, because just the way participants are thinking, I'm thinking, like, can't he continue for a few more minutes? Like, I really want to listen to him more, So it's like, if you remember, during our college days, we used to demand for once more during the song performance. So I was listening to your poetic representation of all these critical theorization regarding actually very important issues, which we don't broach often in global health and public health, because they are very limited to sociology, cultural studies, and literature. People don't often talk about these things in medicine and global health, because these disciplines are very, very technocritical. They are technocratic in nature, extremely technocratic, and they like it to be that way. In fact, they like it. So that bias will stay. It's not like we are going to remove it in a generation or by a few lectures or with a little bit of engagement. It will take generations of you know, engagement to probably do away with that. But before that, I must do the rest of the activities of the training session. So what I'll do now, participants, please keep posting questions in the Q&A. I'll be taking some of your questions now. I'll be asking them to Professor Datta, and he'll be responding to that. And after that, after the session will come to an end, obviously. So Dr. Aftabuddin is asking, do you think PAR has some role in decolonization?
That's a great question. And I think, Dr. Aftab, a lot of this depends upon sort of where exactly PAR is conceptualized. And I think what I'm inviting us to do is to think through the architectures within which a concept is conceptualized. So to the extent that PAR is devised within the development sector, and coming from the sector, it is very much inhabiting the architectures of the sector. So the question will be, how do we place PAR in dialogue with community, particularly communities at the margins, and with the concept of voice infrastructures that I was talking about. So when communities truly own these voice infrastructures and participatory spaces, can we then start seeing openings for decolonizing registers? That's my 2 cents.
Sure. Arindam has 3 questions for you again. So he's asking, why do even developed countries fund, and what's their agenda? First question. Second question, what would be the role of data in communication, and how does data shape the language of communication? And the third question he's asking, often communities don't easily accept people outside their communities. In such cases, how to learn and work with them?
So remember, I want to go back to that third question in terms of communities not accepting outsiders. And I think communities are rightfully untrusting. If you give me a minute, I will just get my my computer charger, because my computer is running out of battery.
Yes, please. So participants, please remain patient. Please keep asking questions in the Q&A. We'll be taking some of them now. Okay. The link for the certification, the feedback will be shared. So remain patient, please. Okay. And okay. You can keep raising, but please keep the questions coming. That's very essential, because this is the last time when you will get to ask questions, and I will read out your important questions. Okay. So if you want to ask anything to Dr. Datta right now, please go ahead and ask in the Q&A. And as soon as he comes back, I'll be asking him. Okay, so Professor Datta is back now. So I can then, Professor Datta, please continue.
Yes, so what I was going to say is that communities rightfully have a lot of history of being extracted from and exploited, so they don't trust outsiders. There is an ongoing mistrust. And remember what I talked about in terms of building a habit of patient listening to an ethic of the other. And that means that to develop solidarity first before engaging in communities is to show up in struggles, is to actually be there, witnessing and being alongside, and to actually be showing up when called upon, right? And what that essentially means is things like participating in movements, participating in struggles, and being ready to do the kinds of things that we are not trained as academics to do, right? Which is um, being ready to grow the crops, being ready to work in the community gardens. You saw our work in community gardens. So we do that work in community garden, you know, growing the food and planting the seeds, being ready to do basic work like postering, being in processions, you know, those everyday aspects of living are really important in terms of building the relationship and building the trust. But I also want to invite us to think about trust in non-functional and non-pragmatic ways, because we are trained in public health um, and health communication to think of trust as a mediator variable. So you build trust to get somewhere else. It shouldn't be, your trust is not your boat ride into next set of data collection, but trust itself is a relationality. It's a value that you uphold. And I think that's really critical. So that's a great question that you asked there. The other question in terms of, you know, what you raised
Funding.
within, why do developed
The first
countries
is
fund? And historically, developed countries have funded, you know, if you think about it within the context of the post-Cold War social sciences and public health and development agenda, um, the Marshall Plan, funding of development was conceptualized as a way to prevent third world countries from becoming communist nations or socialist nations. So it was very much an agenda of promoting US capital and US geostrategic interests. So you have to think about that broader logic that shapes the landscape of funding, including foundations like the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, very much part of that imperial architecture. So your next question was about the relationship with data and communication. So communication and data are intertwined. Communication is based out of data, and in turn, meanings, architectures, interpretations make up the data. So that intertwined relationship actually shapes how communication itself and the language of communication itself is datafied. So when you are talking about decolonizing communication or health communication, that's why it's so important to think about land, ecosystems, collective logics, because they move us out of these extractive cycles within which data are conceptualized.
yeah. Okay, there is a particular comment, but I would like to. Hene Kwaku Kere is saying, on the issue of funding, I think we can really look at how Donald Trump's presidency has affected healthcare around the world. Think USA funding, USAID funding cuts, or even research funding cuts for minoritized population. It makes it clear why the impact cannot be the source of funding for radical work, because the impact exists to benefit and to also extract from communities. So I would like you to make some comments from your work.
Absolutely. You have hit the nail right on the head. So USAID funding has never really supported radical work. In fact, if you look at USAID funding in places like Guatemala, in Peru, they have often been part of counterinsurgency operations. They have often been part of operations to thwart or subvert people's movements and radical movements by actually constructing health as an individual behavior change model. So it's really important to think about the hegemony of that ideology. So when we are thinking of models like theory of planned behavior or theory of reasoned action. These are typical models that we use in health communication to design messages. They inhabit that broader colonial history within which, or diffusion of innovations. I've written quite a bit on diffusion of innovations. And if you think about that broad architecture of how diffusion of innovations campaigns came to be, they were often in the form of promoting family planning in the global south, often with a predetermined agenda of promoting US geostrategic interests and preventing countries like India from signing up to the Soviet bloc. I mean, that was the broader geostrategic agenda. And I think it's really important to think through that colonial question. So with Trump dismantling USAID, while I do understand and appreciate the anxieties expressed by many public health colleagues about fundamental infrastructure disappearing, it is also important to remember the colonial history of USAID in terms of not just not doing radical work, but actually subverting radical work and subverting communities and co-opting concepts like participation to support hegemonic power structures.
Yeah. Okay. There is another question from Manisha Pandit. She's saying, in health projects, non-profit, the accountability is drifted to the funding agency rather than the community. At the same time of drafting proposals, seeking funding, brainstorming is an issue. However, once the funding is released, the whole focus shifts to utilizing the budget, even if there is no such change. Positionality gets stuck here. Is there any other way of interpreting this?
Exactly. So this is why this whole project-based framework itself is deeply problematic in the sense that it continues to fund a system of participation where the accountability is almost always to the funder. So it ends up being an infrastructure where we move from one project report to another. And this, I say, as someone who has worked on very large projects and recognizing the ways in which project deliverables and project goals consume the life of the work, leaving very little space for solidarity building. So, in fact, I want to say this, Manisha, and I say this, of course, recognizing my own privilege as a senior academic, which is that most of the radical work that I have been able to do or have the humble space to be able to do is outside of those large funding structures, often supported by small university grants or city council support or local government council support, things like that, where communities are able to actually shape what that architecture of funding looks like rather than this coming from top down. The other thing I want to say is that the way in which the infrastructure of funding is set up by settler colonial states and by capitalist structures is by putting organizations or NGOs or civil society in competition with each other. And often the funding, therefore, remains stuck mostly in the professional managerial classes, funding project managers and administrators, but much a limited amount actually going into the hands of communities. So one of the sad things I've often seen is the ways in which communities continue to be disenfranchised while an entire NGO class profits in the name of poverty, in the name of rurality, in the name of indigeneity. It becomes another set of post-colonial elites that continue to perpetuate the system. So, one of the things, whether in working in the US or whether working in India, I have noticed is sort of, for those at the margins, often that are seduced by, say, populist narratives, be it Hindutva or be it white supremacy, the NGO sector often doesn't have a proper response because the NGO sector has historically worked to disenfranchise the margins. So I think it's a real question. That's why for radical democracy, that how do we fundamentally reimagine democracy with hope and imagination and with love, such that it turns through the question of how communities can participate in these voice infrastructures rather than NGOs and academics setting up the rules of the game?
Yes. Joseph Antoine wants us to read some of their cultural writing. Their writing. Are you familiar with the undermentioned? The ways we produce, distribute, and consume food shape communities, the lives of individuals, and the world around us. Justice and people's sovereignty must therefore define our food systems. Food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through socially just, ecologically sound, and sustainable methods, and their collective right to define their own policies, strategies, and systems for food production, distribution, and consumption. It is the Nailini Declaration 2007. Nailini was a woman. So that's what they wanted us to read, because this is something which is in the context of our discussion. So I think it's also relevant quite a lot. Thank you for sharing this.
Kia ora, Joseph. Thank you so much for sharing this. It's really, really beautiful. And I think, isn't this amazing? Across multiple indigenous traditions, often led by women, we see these similar concepts emerge of sovereignty, of ownership of food in ways that are grounded in ethics of justice, of love and connection. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, okay. The next question is from Oshia Manangajira. They are asking how best can the primary healthcare approach be utilized to address the decolonization agenda?
Yeah. So, what that would essentially mean is building voice infrastructures where communities have significant say, ownership over the organizing of primary healthcare. And we see this across the various forms of organizing socialist health, for instance. You have seen these experiments in Brazil in terms of community health infrastructures rooted in the organizing of poor people's collectives. We see this in India in terms of at the crux of indigenous protests and protest movements, indigenous ownership of health infrastructures run by indigenous communities, even if for short spans of time, they offer glimmers of insights into the ways in which primary healthcare can be fundamentally reorganized by rooting them in community ownership and voice infrastructures.
There are some points which they have raised, and they are very actually surreal and little pessimistic, but that's the sad reality. For example, Manisha Pandit is saying how to keep the positionality unbiased in such cases. Power and money lie in whiteness, else you can't succeed. So as a practitioner, I dream of getting into WHO, BMGF, etc. because others neither value your curiosity as a scholar. All what they are looking for is managers, not critical thinkers.
Manisha, and so first of all, I tautoko you. Tautoko is a Maori word for upholding you and honor you. I honor your honesty in saying this, and absolutely, yes, I think that the public health infrastructure is invested in sustaining managers, not critical thinkers, precisely because the hegemonic public health infrastructure upholds this capitalist colonial apparatus. And I think, where I find hope, and again, I invite you to look at the Kaupapa Maori model of health in Aotearoa, New Zealand and it's a movement, it's a fairly large movement of indigenous health that started from Aotearoa, New Zealand, but is a global movement. You see it in Canada, you see it in with Native American communities in the US, you see it in Hawaii, and it basically offers us a model of organizing health based upon those values of connected to land, to community, and to love. And what that essentially means is the logic through which how health resources are allocated, how preventive resources are planned, turn to communities as owners of decision making. So I really hear your pessimism. And at the same time, in my own work, I have seen how it can be really transformative when we turn to voice infrastructures and recognize that communities often hold power, and they don't need our permission to do the work that they do to organize for health and well-being, including in India. I've been amazed at the Santali communities I've worked in, and the ways in which communities gain power by simply building those voice infrastructures where they can participate. It's a simple concept, but I think it also can be very transformative. Now, one of the things is then with respect to that, Professor Satpathy talked about my work on the WHO advisory group on cultural context of health, and we produced a series of reports, WHO guidelines on cultural context of health. And one of the things we try to do with those guidelines is to shape the global policy landscape and policy conversations on culture and health and community. And hopefully that also builds registers for national governments and national policies, at least in terms of public infrastructures and responses and holding them accountable. I mean, I have several critiques of India in the context of Hindutva and the organizing of deeply disenfranchising structures. And at the same time, I think if you look at the ASHA model, in terms of the community health workers, the Anganwadi workers, it is also a powerful model in terms of grassroots distribution of health infrastructures. Of course, there are flaws, there are limits, and yet at the same time, in many communities at the margins, I've seen that space of negotiation with Anganwadi and Asha as well,
Okay, there are three comments come question by Hene Kwaku Kere. They are asking, in the context of health communication research that engages with history and the archive, how to engage with the archive in a manner that is ethical, representative, and not extractive? That's the first question. So, and then I'll go to the next two at the end.
Hene, again, a beautiful question. And I think what I would suggest is to engage with the archive that is ethical, is to engage with communities that are most situated around the archive. And what I mean by that, of course, I recognize that archives are historical, but I also recognize that they are living, breathing communities that often live around the archive, whose relationalities hold up the archive, and the archive exists in relationship with those communities. And I think it's important to recognize the ownership of communities and community voice infrastructures over those archival spaces. So, one of the things, again, with indigenous sovereignty has been fundamentally about turning the idea of archives and data on its head, noting that archives are not just things of the past. These things that were often gathered from indigenous people were gathered without consent, were gathered without permission, were gathered by carrying out violence. So to recognize that then is to build ethical relationships with communities about how to engage archives in relational ways, because archives are not just data fixed in the past, they're also living, breathing stories with present day connections. Thank you.
Exactly. So there are two more. They're a bit more critical and maybe contentious, but I will still read it out because at the Global Consortium of Global Health, which is not funded by anybody, we do not believe in suppressing anyone's expression. So we believe in giving them a voice. So Hene is putting two comments here. There are questions also. Again, on the issue of trust, has the academy not done enough to warrant mistrust? And when I use academy here, let us recognize the academy as what it is, an agent of the empire. And so let's consider how fake CIA vaccination initiative in places like Pakistan led to mistrust in public health initiative. The mistrust in this sense is actually rational and somewhat a survival strategy. Second, And when we think of ways that communities can support themselves, we can look at the Black Panthers Party food initiative in black communities, of course, which the CIA tried to disrupt through various means. So this is a comment, but the first one is a sort of critical question.
I love that question. Absolutely. So, in that sense, the academy is complicit in the extractive empire. In fact, extraction has happened through our participation as academics, and absolutely, in that sense, the mistrust is a rational response. It's a response to safeguard and to protect knowledge systems, bodies, land. So, um, uh, the question for decolonization is, again, I come back to the question of solidarity, which is how does one then show up knowing this history of academe, right, which is a fraught history? How do we then as academics show up in contemporary struggles? And as we see that we are living in the midst of multiple contemporary struggles. So for me, personally, a lot of it is about showing up. It is about showing up to Palestinian protests against Gaza. It is about showing up to Maori protests against the ongoing attacks on Tetiriti, and the acts of showing up not as ways to secure trust, but as ways to be in solidarity, you know. And I think from that, you know, one of the things that I often find, and of course, this comes with my privilege and long history of working in multiple contexts, I often find that I am invited into communities to work alongside in asking a particular question or exploring a particular issue. And that invitation in becomes a calling for accountability, right? Because that accountability now has shifted. Because for me, it is, am I able to show up when I'm called in to do some research? So I will give you an example. In New Zealand, you know, we are sort of as part of the Trump ecosystem, the global far right, you know, have found New Zealand to be a pretty important targets precisely because of Tetiriti and because New Zealand offers a model in Western democracies for fighting against white supremacy. So I'm often called upon by Maori activists or by indigenous communities to write up white papers, policy briefs on the techniques and strategies of far right, and on strategies for resisting it as a communication academic. So I find that invitation coming from that relationality of being in solidarity. And then, you know, thank you for bringing up the health system run by the Black Panther Party. That is a great example of an anti-colonial, decolonial health infrastructure, very much in line with Black liberatory traditions, African American liberatory traditions, and Global South liberatory traditions of organizing health.
Okay, so thank you. I have a question for you, Professor Datta. Since everyone
Yes,
has asked,
Professor Satpathy.
I should quench a little bit of my thirst as well. So I have been wondering, what do you think? Because you have been in the West, you have lived in Asia, and you are born in India. So what do you think? What would academics do? Like, what do they need to do, maybe moving forward, to earn the trust, and also maybe do a little bit more than what they do in their comfort zones? You know, just doing some research, publishing in top journals, sometimes playing with the words in the form of word salads published in top journals, and then earning trust of the community, often abusing that in the name of publications, grants, and many other things. Where do we go from here? I mean, like, how can we keep the trust moving as we go ahead? Because the world is increasingly becoming very, very divided. Means if you look at the Twitter wars which are going on a daily basis, I think the war is very, very imminent. The divide between the people, and they're all justified. It's not like I see them as unjustified. Means I think we have failed majorly in terms of keeping our trust and earning it. So where do we go, and what should be our strategy, or what should be our way of looking and working around things, not just like as a strategy to maneuver and earn success, but maybe becoming true agents of the people rather than becoming agents of empire or state or corporations. Because right now, if I look at academics in general, I look at them as agents of these three entities: the state, the corporations, or the empire.
What a challenging question, Professor Satpathy, and I want to begin by, saying the words of Tame Iti, who's a Maori activist, and I put up his picture on the first slide of CARE that I showed. There was a room, and there was someone lecturing, and people were sitting across the podium, and Tame was one of the first activists at the center, and he said something. He said that decolonization is not about bringing in all these registers of knowledge into the university, but about moving the fundamental space of knowledge generation outside of the university into communities. So, and as a Bengali, that Bengalis love Tagore. So I have to bring in a Tagore example and say that if you look at Shantiniketan as an example, the way in which the concept of Shantiniketan was built was this open space where the university was under trees, not separated out in buildings around walls. So I think a big part of building trust is learning to be in community, and a big part of that is learning how to undo the walls that separate the academe from community. And I think that increasingly, and it's really funny because and kind of sad too, as I've engaged with Indian universities, for instance, I see the proliferation of many private Indian universities that charge a lot of money, where education is increasingly a commodity. And of course, parents want pathways for their children, and understandably so. But at the same time, I worry that education in this kind of a foreclosed way, as a property and as a commodity and as a site of profiteering, is increasing, and with these various metrics, is increasingly divorced from, separated from community and the struggles of community. So I think, Professor Satpathy, our challenge as academics is learning how to dismantle the walls around which we live, And I will give you a very personal example, because I think it can be also very satisfying once we learn to build those relationships. And as a part of my work, like what you were pointing out, I've faced various targeted campaigns, be it from Hindutva trolls trying to get me fired, to Zionists, to white supremacists targeting me. And, the biggest source of support I've found is in community, community activists and community organizers coming in and saying that what are the kinds of support we can offer you to make sure that you are safe. So I also think that when we venture out, we gain a lot, maybe not in those kinds of narrowly metricized ways, but certainly in terms of the relationships, the communities we learn to live in, because otherwise I think our lives are so separated out from the breathing organismic lives of communities. We almost live in gated spaces, if you will, And I think a big part of the challenge is in learning how to dismantle these gated spaces. I went for my undergraduate degree at IIT Kharagpur. And in fact, I was very privileged in some ways because, my father worked at IIT, and my great-grand uncle, Sir J.C. Ghosh, was the founder of IIT Kharagpur and the founding director of IIT Kharagpur. And, the spaces when I went into IIT were open spaces, meaning the university was surrounded by trees, which opened up to neighboring communities. And there lived many rural communities all around where we would go and do our NSS work, for instance, including the literacy camps and the learning camps and things like that. Now, when I returned to IIT, The university has become a zoned community. It is separated by big walls with fancy buildings, and those communities have turned into sort of these destitute spaces that are zoned out. It seems like more and more academia and university spaces are invested in zoning out the margins, making those invisible. And of course, at the same time, running these community engagement programs as part of CSR to look good. It is quite an irony. So I think part of it is being able to name these things and then to see how we can continue to dismantle these walls. Of course, with the current regime, there is active suppression of dissent, the active suppression of student participation in protest, and the continuous pathologization, if you will, of student participation in community, right? So the challenge, I think, is how do we sustain these spaces of dissent that offer us ways of finding connection to community. And I want to wrap up by saying I found that the best ways for me to learn are from my students. You look at what is going on across US campuses. There is a reawakening. I think, there was a point of time in the 1980s, for instance, with the AIDS crisis. US went through a tectonic shift in terms of public opinion around LGBTQI issues. In a similar kind of way, perhaps now we are seeing a tectonic shift in public opinion around Palestine and the Israel-Palestine conflict, and that is being led by our students. It's amazing. And you will see me writing about this, how often the post-colonial and decolonial scholars that have made their lives out of writing out of this stuff are completely absent when it comes to the Palestinian struggle. But our students are showing us the way about how to be in community. So I think I want to wrap up by saying that if we look at our young people and learn from them and learn to listen from them, I find a lot of hope there. Thank you.
But I have another question to ask, which is very
Please go ahead.
critical to ask at this point. The question is, do we, because I am counting myself in that lot as well, although I don't myself associate with that crowd, do we as academics have the need, the desire, and the moral courage to actually pursue that level of activism and advocacy? Because many times I feel, I don't want to statistically quantify it, but that's my overall observation, and I'm not trying to put us versus them here, in terms of how people generally do. But what I'm trying to say is that most of my observation has told me, and that also makes me a little bit frustrated and disappointed with academia as a profession, and whether I should continue in it. Like most of the academics are very, very comfortable in their position and do not want to actually move out of their comfort zones. And even if they claim they want to, they're actually not doing it. Like, for example, as you rightly said and cited, many people who used to talk about decolonization, post-colonial, decolonization, all kinds of theorization, all kinds of debates and discourses, did not engage with the Palestinian fights. And when it started, in fact, they went ahead. Either one group stopped, became silent, other group went and supported Israel's right to defend. So what do I say? I mean, I honestly, sometimes I say to my students and everyone I know, we live in a highly, highly hypocritical society and world. So we need to be very, very clear in terms of what our true ideologies and belief systems are. Because until unless we are fully acknowledging that, even if you don't want to acknowledge it publicly, even if you are not aware of it, like in a psychologist sense, you are not self-aware of it, then I think you are going nowhere. You are literally deceiving yourself. And if you're deceiving your own self, then you are moving nowhere as human beings, as individuals. Then obviously, if the society is composed of such people en masse, obviously the society will speak a lot about what kind of society it is. And then now we have Donald Trump as president. So obviously the leaders are representatives of the people also at the end of the day. It's not just that they have just come out of the blue from somewhere by deceiving someone. And the same speaks for India as well. So I don't want to be more contentious because I live in India. So I fully echo the sentiments that you have already said. So that is my last question to you, if you would like to shed some light on that.
Oh my goodness, yeah, I think that whether it is in the US, whether it is in India, whether it is in Brazil, one of the things that has happened with platform capital is a fundamental transformation of the societies. And I just want to use this as an example, even because, I've long sort of witnessed the Palestinian struggle as an Indian, growing up in the 70s and 80s. You think of the imagination of Indira Gandhi and Yasser Arafat and Fidel Castro and the non-aligned movement, and that imaginary. Indian people stood beside Palestinian people because we understood what anti-colonial struggle meant, and we saw ourselves as global leaders in sort of how to organize radical democracy, if you will, in the Gandhian way, the Panchayati Raj, and in anti-colonial politics. But I think over the last 15 years, there is a fundamental transformation of that society where a sort of self-aggrandizement, self-posturing have become incentivized, if you will. And, one of the things, because I study platforms and digital spaces, and I do ethnography of digital spaces, one of the things I've found pretty striking is how these digital architectures have fundamentally rewired people, if you will, around particular logics. Now, it's an interesting question whether these tendencies were always there. One would assume that these tendencies were already there. Now they have been given fodder in a particular kind of structure where being servile and upholding basically being the bootlickers of the structure is what is incentivized and supported. And one has to be a coward in order to become a winner in the structure, to actually ask critical questions or to be dissenting, one becomes a loser, It is very interesting terms. In my work, I talk about this as communicative inversion, which is turning materiality on its head through discursive tropes. So having integrity, standing up for something, being known for standing up for something are the traits of a loser in this new sort of discursive infrastructure, if you will. So in that system, then, our compliance into this structure is what is incentivized as celebrated. So to the extent that we keep our head down and we collaborate with the structure in its almost fascist impulses, and I see this as part of the rise of global fascism, then we are seen as sort of the people to be celebrated or as markers of success. And to stand against it, then, is what is seen as a trait of someone who is uncivil, non-cooperative, not a team player. There are all these labels and stigmas that are put on people. I mean, I look at spaces like the Film and Television Institute of India or Jawaharlal Nehru University, or, a space that I'm quite familiar with, the Indian Institute of Mass Comm. These are all important spaces of learning, or for that matter, my alma mater, IIT, how these have been turned into particular kind of infrastructures for managerial logics. It's now the same thing that you're seeing in the US with Project 2025 and sort of the attack on DEI, critical race theory, and on critical academic voices, right? So within that context, what is also really interesting is that those academics that publish in journal spaces and journal articles and books and are not publicly visible are fine. It is those that actually are public scholars, public intellectuals, publicly engaging, that are targeted to be silenced, right? So we have to ask this question: what is it about these architectures of global fascism that seek to silence academic voices, particularly in places that matter? And then I guess my question for you, Professor Satpathy, is in the midst of that, I have found that there are enough academic voices that will push back. Even though they are few, there are people like you that will push back and try to figure out what are the spaces of dissenting. And the question for me is that how do we build these spaces of solidarity among academics that push back, that create these infrastructures for maintaining some level of decency in terms of having integrity, having a commitment to the academic voice in the midst of this onslaught. I think it's a real question for us in terms of how we build these global networks and global connections. One of the things, again, I go back to indigenous people, one of the things that I've found really amazing about Maori academics is that they seem to, even most senior academics, seem to not give a damn about the structure, or not give a damn about the credentials, and are able to fight back and push back. And I think it is partly because they retain deeply within themselves the commitment to indigeneity and commitment to ideas of land that anchors them and anchors their struggle. So in that way, I think I will wrap up by saying that I think it's a moment for us to find, academia is in crisis very clearly. And it's an invitation for us to find what those anchors are for us that will hold us and root us and ground us and give us love and community and connection. Thank you.
Maybe we need to invest a little bit more on building the solidarity.
Yes.
Like find our own people. And
yes.
Means I know the community is not very big compared to the large ecosystem in which we operate. So maybe focus more on that, invest more on that emotionally at an affective level. Okay, so what a wonderful lecture. There are still questions coming up, and unfortunately we can't take all of them. But it's been a real and rare privilege as well as honor for me as the CEO and founder of Global Health Forum and Global Consortium of Global Health Actors, Leaders and Thinkers, ALT. We are the global alternative. That's our tagline, and it's not just as a fancy. It is actually, it's been given after a lot of careful deliberation and discourses and debates, inside our team. Like, what should be our tagline? What should we be actually standing for? So initially it was just Global Consortium of Global Health. Then I thought it can't be just Global Consortium of Global Health, because how are we doing different things compared to the white power-centered global health model that is already existing? So if we are claiming that we are actually driven by Global South and led by Global South, who are we? Who are we representing? What's our positionality statement as an organization of value? So then we created this ALT, which obviously was created in few days' time, and it was very instantaneous because it was already there in our heads that yes, we want to represent an alternative, and it just happened. Like, I was sleeping, and I'm not bluffing here. I was sleeping. I got up from the bed, and I communicated in the group. I can still share the screenshot with you. I said that our organization is going to be named as Actors, Leaders and Thinkers, Global Alt. And they were like surprised, like, what happened? In early morning you were sending us messages. I'm like, yes, this thought came to me like a eureka moment. I just got up from the bed and this came. So I, on behalf of Global Consortium of Global Health Actors, Leaders and Thinkers, ALT, and Global Health Forum, would like to thank you, Professor Datta, for coming on the virtual stage. I hope we'll have the privilege of again hosting you in physical form in sometime in future. And our Global Advanced Certification Program is almost on the verge of completion. Their exams are going to start very soon, and then they will be completing their certification program. But the International Workshop Series has been continuing for the past 12 weeks now, and we have more than close to 4,000, so more than 3,900 registrants so far from all over the world. So that, and 170 plus countries, without spending a single rupee, single taka, single anything, no sponsorship, no support from anyone, not a single human being, nobody. It's just pure effort of love, labor of love, that has brought us so far, and we're extremely proud of that also, because we are able to maintain our own sovereignty. We are self-governed, self-autonomous. We are not dependent on anyone. So whatever we want to talk about, we can talk about in our forum, and we do not get suppressed by anybody. Nobody at least gets to tell us what to say and what not to say during this time. So that is our rare privilege as well. So with heartfelt gratitude, I would like to place on record that Professor Datta, we are very happy and very grateful to have you. We look forward to all the future opportunities to have you on the board of Global Consortium Global Health. We would, in your presence, I would request Hazel, the Chief Operating Officer of Global Consortium of Global Health, to present something which we have been planning for quite some time. Hazel, if you would like to come on board, and we are going to inaugurate 3 very important dissemination channels for all the voices of Global South, of Global Health. So Faisal, if you're ready, would you like to screen share with your hands? आपके कर कमलों से, ठीक है, Faisal. So the participants, those who are here, we are inaugurating 3 journals. First is Global Journal of Global Health, sponsored by all our partners. Then the second is the Global Journal of Health Equity, and the third, the Global Journal of Innovation. These are the first 3 journals that we are going to publish, and we are inviting many people to join us on the advisory board. So I would request you, Professor Mohanjay Dattari, to kindly join us on the board of advisory board and editorial board. We would be very honored to have you. So these are journals not going to be maintained in a very traditional sense, like published to make people happy. They'll be published because they will talk about all the important issues, in real sense. And obviously research, scientific research, there will be no compromise in terms of scientific rigor. We'll maintain their objectivity, but we'll also give enough space to all the stakeholders from Global South so that they can have a respectful and dignified space to communicate all that is happening in global health and development arena, and that needs to be spoken about where they don't get space to talk about. So I would like you to say a few words about, I know I didn't get enough time to tell you about this, but I would hope and request if you could say a few words. This is just a very humble beginning.
My goodness, this is so beautiful and powerful. Many hearty congratulations, and it's such an honor to be with you on this day when you're inaugurating these important journals. I talked about voice infrastructures, and here you have voice infrastructures as a beautiful example of voice infrastructures that you have created. I'm humbled that you would ask me to be on the advisory board, and I would be happy to. And I wish you all the best in building this space, which hopefully over the years to come, I know will be a space where many global South voices get to shape what the knowledge structures of global health look like. And in that process, create the basis for transforming the architecture of global health. So many congratulations, Professor Satpathy and your team. And really, it's a powerful example of communicative sovereignty.
Indeed. And we want to build on the power of all communities, which are our true strength. And the entire process has been operational with the power of communities, all people who have come together, volunteered for the past 12 weeks to run the Global Advanced Certification Program, as well as the International Workshop Series. We are extremely indebted to all of you, and we want to place on record our heartfelt, deep sense of gratitude to everyone who is on the board, who is not hearing us. The recordings are going to be there, so you will listen to us for all eternity. And we hope these journals, these dissemination platforms will be the true voice, the authentic voice of every one of you, those who are voiceless and those who have never got a seat on the table. So that's all from my side. I would like to again thank you, Professor Datta, for coming on board and spending so much time with us. It's 2 a.m. In New Zealand. It's like very late, I know, but we are very, very grateful that you have chosen to come and spend an entire night, I mean, like almost half of the night with us in New Zealand time. So it's, I couldn't have thanked you more, and I look forward to all the future opportunities to engage with you and work with you, sir. And yeah, that's all from my side. I'm very emotional. I can't say more. Maybe I'll cry. So I will request Faisal to do the last use.
Thank you, sir. And thank you immensely to Professor Mohan Datto for this transformative lecture. Your session today not only challenged us to rethink the ethics and practices of health communication, but also equipped us with new perspectives grounded in justice, dignity, and meaningful community engagement. It is a timely reminder that public health communication must not speak on behalf of communities, but with them. We also thank our respected moderator, Professor Maheshwar Satpathy, for his insightful facilitation, and to all our participants for your presence and engagement. With that, we conclude today's session. We look forward to welcoming you in our upcoming events. And till then, stay tuned with us, and thank you, everyone.
Okay, but I get to say the last words. Professor Datta, our training participants would get a certificate with your signature, sir. So our admin team would be getting in touch with you, and we have a very fast turnaround process. So they would be getting in touch with you today itself. I know it's very late, so please feel free to send your signatures tomorrow. Oblige us with that. And everyone is also asking for the slides. So if you could kindly say it, that would be grateful. Great. And with that, I know I don't want to take more time from you. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful night and take care. I shall be in touch with you. Take care. Bye.
Thank you so much, Professor Satpathy, for inviting me. It's been an honor to be with you all.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, participants, stay tuned because this is not the end. Every sweet and beautiful thing has to come to an end. So with this, Global Advanced Certification Program's last training comes to an end. However, our Global Health Dialogue series will remain. So it is coming back with a new format in August. Okay, we'll take a short break about 15 days now so that we can conduct the examination process for our participants. And once that is over, in the last week of July, we'll be coming back in August with a new format. And until then, stay tuned, take care of yourself, eat and sleep well, and stay safe. God bless you. Bye. That's all from myself. Thank you. So